All right, I think actually go ahead and get started. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here. My name's Joy DeLizo Osborne, and I'm so happy to welcome you to tonight's event. It's Not Too Early, LGBTQ plus advocacy in elementary schools. As you can see, a few folks have already started to add some resources in the chat, but if you have others to share as we start, please feel free. We'd love to hear any favorite books or resources that you use to honor Black and or LGBTQ plus identities in your work. Yeah. So just quickly, in terms of engaging respectfully with each other this evening, a few guidelines. One, please use the chat feature throughout this conversation. We totally value your voices. Feel free to share constructive ideas, resources, and comments. We are recording the presentation portion of this session to share afterwards on our website, achievethecore.org. We will have the opportunity to come together for Q&A later in this session. Please keep track of your questions until then. And anyone who engages in cyberbullying or deliberate attempts to intimidate other commenters or disrupt conversation will be promptly removed. And lastly, if you would like, you can feel free to discuss the conversation on social as we chat tonight. I see a comment or a message about letting folks in from the waiting room. We will be admitting folks from the waiting room throughout, so if you have anyone that's waiting to join us, they should be with us soon. Great, tonight's guest is Bex Mui. Her pronouns are she and her, and she is an LGBTQ and equity consultant. I'll let her introduce herself a little bit more thoroughly, but we're so excited to have her back. She was with us back in November, talking about queering curriculum in general. And from that conversation, we got so many questions about elementary school that we wanted to make this space this evening. So super excited to have Bex back with us tonight. Bex, do you want to tell us any more about yourself?
Sure, and yeah, just so happy to be here with you all and to be invited into this conversation. I was just mentioning that so much of my work when you're talking about LGBTQ advocacy, even in K-12 schools, it's so often middle and high school focused. And my background is I'm an elementary teacher. And so I come to this advocacy and the support work through a lens of being in the classroom, of working in inclusion classrooms with children with special needs and gen ed kids in the same classes, and also in working in districts and doing grassroots organizing with collectives of radical educators. And so I've approached this in a lot of different ways, but my really frame came from having conversations with my students in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade. And so I'm really delighted to be able to share some of the things I've worked on and to offer some supports for folks that are interested in bringing this work to our elementary ages.
Awesome. Well, super excited to have you back. Thank you so much for being here. Tonight, our conversation will be probably like the first 20 minutes. Then we'll open up for some Q&A and then give folks some chances to go into smaller groups to have a conversation about ways you might apply what you've learned or heard to your work before coming back for a final question and answer session. So our first question really is, this question that so many folks ask, which is why in elementary school? Why start LGBTQ plus advocacy so early? What's important about that?
Yeah, I think this is really an important frame, and whether this is something that you're wondering as a participant or if you're looking for language and supports for how to bring this advocacy to other folks that you're working with or schools that you're a part of, it is really critical to kind of start with the why. And elementary education, really, it's a foundational time for students to learn about themselves, their families, and the world around them. And a lot of elementary curriculum, in addition to skill building, is also about building empathy and understanding and respect. So leaving out the existence of LGBTQ people and families from this education is becoming increasingly detrimental to students' growth. especially as we're seeing an increase in representation for queer and trans people in our country, in our government, in our media, and likely in our students' communities. Additionally, a large portion of LGBTQ inclusion in elementary schools is talking about identity and gender. And so setting up a foundation for understanding gender outside of binary stereotypes for boys and girls, that's beneficial for all students. And it's critical that that happen in elementary before puberty education.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that frame. I think it's so important to think so really broadly about what it means to be an advocate for LGBTQ plus folks, and thinking about just being gender nonconforming, different ways of engaging, questioning gender roles, you know, boys liking dolls, like all of these things sort of come into this broad umbrella of just teaching students to respect one another and in their differences and similarities. What would you say that advocating for LGBTQ plus folks, students, families, community members, and staff members actually looks like in a K-5 setting?
I really appreciate the framing for this conversation. And I think when we are talking about LGBTQ inclusion, affirmation, advocacy, it does need to include all of these different constituents. And part of that, I would start by just calling in folks, making sure that all of those folks that you've mentioned, including faculty members and administration, are clear about the value of LGBTQ visibility and supports in elementary schools, and have a shared understanding of what it is and what it isn't. I think it's also important that this work be admin-led. There are so many elementary school educators and classroom teachers who are doing some of this work, but it's not necessarily being done systemically in the school. So a given student or classroom might have a better understanding of LGBTQ people and a broader definition of gender and gender stereotypes than another student in that same school. And so having this be led and having professional development for educators that's needed, be provided for and budgeted for by administrators and school leaders is a really important part of LGBTQ advocacy.
I would also, go ahead.
But I also just want to add the importance of inclusive curriculum and making sure that not only is there an environment that's inclusive, but that when we think about inclusive curriculum, that it isn't just a single lesson being taught once a year, but that there's really multiple times throughout the school year where LGBTQ people are mentioned and talked about in an affirming way. And that there are also opportunities throughout the year where whole school community can come together. So having assemblies, inviting families, having those multiple times a year outside of just Pride Month can be a really important part of creating an inclusive school, and making sure that this is something that's mentioned at the beginning of the year. Front loading is always a great idea. And so talking about this kind of in curriculum at curriculum night at the beginning of the school year can be a great way to make sure that families are also clued into the conversation.
Yeah, I think that is one of the biggest questions we receive. And actually, even I, as like an LGBTQ parent, right? Sort of wonder about is when I look at my daughter's preschool curriculum, and I'm like, there's no representation here. I wonder, will they get negative feedback if there is, and how do I support the staff in addressing that? Do you have thoughts on ways that schools can be proactive in just preparing the community for the broadening of the conversation, the changing of tradition that they're looking at engaging?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I think that as an elementary school teacher, right, someone who worked in schools, I felt like half of my job was working with families and half was working with my young people. I think there's a lot, especially the family involvement in elementary age is larger than at other stages in student lives. And so I think that is something to acknowledge around when you are introducing potentially new subjects into a curriculum. And I think that's why it's so important that families be included in this process. I work with administrators to help them distinguish between pushback and questions. A lot of times we consider everything to be pushback, and we are sometimes so scared or nervous that we're going to get pushback that folks are not willing to move forward. And so really just encouraging folks to have the messaging that can help them feel confident in sharing what they're doing, why they're talking about LGBTQ people and people in diverse ways that exist, and also including families in a conversation. The same way that there is multiple times often in an elementary school communication to have communication with families about new things and new units that are being taught. So if you have a newsletter that goes out every week, I mentioned curriculum night, that there's an invitation to families, particularly if this is a new topic for a school community. It's really important for administrators to support educators in talking about why LGBTQ inclusion is part of a larger diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative, hopefully going on at the school, and what they can expect. And also bringing families along, because nobody wants to have their young person, child, come home saying things or asking questions that they weren't prepared to answer. And so it's our responsibility and schools' responsibility to provide opportunities for families to learn alongside their young people and to hear kind of the language and the ways that developmentally appropriate conversations around LGBTQ identities are being had so that they can feel involved and they can model it for themselves and for their families at home.
Awesome. Thank you. That actually is such a good segue to the next question. When you talk about these efforts being part of a larger sort of equity conversation, I think one of the things, especially during Black History Month, we want to make sure to highlight here is the connection between this kind of advocacy and anti-bias, anti-racist teaching, right? Where do you see the connections between these topics? How do they support one another? How do they build on one another to create safe and affirming spaces for all students, teachers?
Such an important question and such an important frame. One of my greatest frustrations in doing this work around just LGBTQ advocacy is how segmented it seems to feel from other equity work, even in school systems. I want to really acknowledge the whitewashing of LGBTQ identity, particularly in advocacy, and really acknowledge how important it is to center LGBTQ people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous people within the community, especially so that when we are providing supports such as inclusive curriculum, GSAs, whatever the supports may be, making sure that the supports that are being provided are reflective of and centering POC within the community and their families. So that really making sure that schools also have you mentioned kind of a proactive versus a reactive approach. All too often the reality is that in schools, if there are family members who are advocating for LGBTQ supports, or if these supports are coming from externally in the community, they're coming from white communities. And that has a lot of, often that's because white LGBTQ people have privileges of time, money, resources, and access to understanding how to navigate school systems and advocacy and policy reform. And unfortunately, that does sometimes mean that the supports that are being put in place are supportive of that community. So really thinking about and reframing LGBTQ supports alongside the other inclusive and diversity measures in a school can help ensure that those aren't as segmented. And that's really how I got started, is working with the diversity director at my school to see what we were doing when we were talking about diversity. What did we really mean? And how could we take, and for us in that school, it really meant talking about race and sometimes talking about income and resources. And so trying to work through the supports as they exist and add a queer and trans lens to that work was a way that we could create a school environment that was more inclusive without separating them, and intentionally more centering white LGBTQ people in our efforts.
Yeah, I think that focus on intersectionality is just like so important, right? I think even in our internal conversations here at SAP, sometimes, you know, we talk about like Black students or like students of color, and then we talk about LGBTQ students, right? And like,
Yes.
I mean, they are one and the same in some cases, right? Like we aren't talking about these like separate segments of people, right? We are everywhere in all groups.
Absolutely. We exist in all the groups, which is one of the beautiful joys of queer identity. And it also, you know, there are times even in schools who will run a GSA at the same time as like cultural clubs and race-based affinity clubs. And so just even in that, without considering, you know, what that does for queer people of color and students of color who are kind of choosing. And so just really thinking about what a student's lived experience is, and making sure that we're not asking LGBTQ students to identify, you know, with one or the other parts of their identities.
Yeah, so helpful. I see a question in the chat about LGBTQ plus curriculum. I'm wondering about our next question, which is resources. When we're thinking about elementary schools in particular, you know, what are some of the places you would suggest folks look for guidance around texts to incorporate ways to think about incorporating this into curriculum overall?
Yes, there are so many resources available, which is really incredible. No one is starting this work or doing it on their own. So one thing I will say, some folks were asking about curriculum advisors and kind of looking it over. I will say GLSEN has a resource on inclusive curriculum that's a reflection guide. And so that's something that you can look at to kind of look at your different curriculum. Really, yes, a lot of times when we say inclusive curriculum or adding an inclusive curriculum, we're thinking about lessons or even units that we're teaching. And while those are really beneficial, and I will highlight, you can see some of them here. Welcoming Schools has some excellent resources, lesson plans, unit. The Ready, Set, Respect Toolkit has lessons that are Common Core aligned. There are other lessons here and resources. The other important aspect of inclusive curriculum is not just talking about LGBTQ people when it is these specific frames. So yes, doing this, and then also thinking about, you know, where can you add LGBTQ visibility in a positive and affirming way into other read alouds, into other units, into other aspects of you know, inventors or whatever it is, story time, story problems during math, and different ways that you can bring LGBTQ visibility outside of these highlighted. And then I also wanted to highlight, sorry, I did this in the wrong order, but there's an LGBTQ advocacy resource that I wanted to highlight. It is a really great kind of starter resource for folks that are kind of doing this work and wanting to have a checklist or engage other folks. It starts with why this work is important and can help you build your idea and your kind of frame for your school community of why this is valuable, why it aligns with your school's missions, values, diversity and equity initiatives as well. It also has some recommendations for administrators, district leaders, classroom educators, some support around addressing questions and pushback, and then some additional resources as well. So I think it's a great place to start as a resource.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing these resources. One of the things I feel like has come up recently as we've started here at SAP to support folks in the transition into anti-bias and anti-racist work, culturally relevant pedagogy, et cetera, is this idea that you also sort of like don't avoid those teachable moments, right? This is one of those things where, especially in elementary school, questions come up. And I think often our knee-jerk reaction is to say like, oh, we don't talk about that. Or like, maybe later, or see me after class, or, you know, like these like sort of like avoidant sort of moves. Are there ways that you have seen work really well for folks to be able to take advantage of the moments that students provide us to sort of dig into these conversations in classrooms?
That is such an important question, and particularly for elementary. You know, in elementary, often there is one teacher or a few teachers that are with the class for the entire year. And so the amount of teachable moments, the amount of things that our young people learn from us by what we don't say and by the tone of our voice, by the way that we communicate, is really relevant to young people. They're very perceptive and they can tell when we're skirting something or skipping something. And I would just honor wherever you are as a teacher in this process, to just do some reflection around that, and to be honest with young people. Like, I'm not sure how to answer that right now. I really appreciate that question, and I'm gonna get back to us, and then to get back to you, and then do get back to them. Just to give some frame for yourself and some grace for yourself as we, have maybe new conversations you haven't had. And the other thing I'll say around teachable moments is, giving grace, because practice, they say it takes about 20 times talking about a new thing out loud before you feel really comfortable. And so just giving yourself, you'll never really get to that 20th time if you don't give yourself those other times. Also using these resources because a lot of them have kind of something that might apply or be part of a discussion in the lesson that you're teaching might be a useful frame for addressing a question that comes up at a different time. And then finally, just having an opportunity for or being really clear from your administration that you are supported, that having this be something that your administration is both providing professional development around and sharing that this is the school's mission, that this is part of your responsibility as a teacher, also can help with classroom educators to feel comfortable to have these conversations and not fear that if they do answer a question or if they are meeting the students where their learning and curiosity is, that they're going to face some type of pushback.
I saw a question really early on in the chat, and folks, if you have questions, please feel free to start to add them in the chat. One of the questions was about resistant colleagues, and I'll just say from my personal experience, it's not even resistant colleagues, right? Like they're resistant family members, right, of mine, right? Like how or what suggestions do you have for folks that feel really uncomfortable or like they don't want to engage in these conversations or they don't agree with the conversation? Are there pointers, thoughts, tips that you have for folks trying to push through to getting their school to be affirming in spite of those challenges?
Absolutely. And people are on their own journeys around this. There is not enough preparation in teacher prep programs for LGBTQ inclusive teaching, setting up an LGBTQ inclusive and affirming learning environment, particularly at the elementary level. So folks do vary. And so what I would, again, just recommend, I think it is administrators' responsibility to set up that school culture. That can also be done and shared with other school leaders, but really thinking about for them how they're providing the education that folks need in order to set up safe and respectful learning communities with the curriculum that has been decided on by the school is really important. I also think that it can be helpful when it is clear what the expectations are. Sometimes we get really large and wanting to change like hearts, minds, bodies, spirits of humans that are really might have had a lifetime of living in our homophobic and transphobic society without larger access to LGBTQ people and affirmation and supports. And so a 1-hour training, a curriculum link is not going to change that. And I think we need to really just acknowledge that. But what we can do is have school leaders be very clear about what LGBTQ inclusion means, what the expected behaviors are, what the expected lessons are, and that is just setting up a respectful environment and to really be clear about what that is and why, and to give people some space for the other parts of their learning and the journey of their learning.
That's such a good point, right? 1 hour PD, a lesson plan, not quite adequate probably to address all of the concerns or questions someone might have if they are reluctant. When you talk to schools and teachers about the need for LGBTQ curricula, are you talking about something that is sort of separate? So I see a question in the chat. It's about like LGBTQ curricula and programs. I think programs might look like you know, a gender spectrum group or a GSA or something like that. But in terms of curriculum, are you really talking about whole units that are sort of separate, that are specific for LGBTQ folks? Or are you talking about a more consistent sort of integration across topics generally?
I would say both, ideally. We do really, like I mentioned, like the best frame for LGBTQ inclusion, especially at the elementary level, is having an environment in which LGBTQ people and representation of a diverse group of LGBTQ people and gender fluid people exist, that they're present in the library, that they're present in, you know, science units, that they're present, we are present throughout the year, and that folks who in the school community, families, educators, administrators, even students who do identify in LGBTQ identities or who are wanting to express their gender in ways that are not fitting into gender stereotypes, that they're welcome and able to be out and don't feel that they need to conform who they are or who is in their family and to external norms. And so that environment is really beneficial. Like that's the ideal environment for curriculum. In addition, there is skills that can be taught. Family units are very common in schools. And so making sure that family units have a diverse representation of families that includes LGBTQ families that have diversity within them, so that there are trans parents, so that there are BIPOC, you know, parents and families, so that those are represented in examples of families, that can make such a big difference. And it lessons around in accepting and embracing the diversity of family structures. And in addition, there's a lot of units. Ready, Set, Respect has a section about gender and looking at gender stereotypes. And so being able to help young people through gender stereotypes and navigating that can be a really great setup and frame for more identity-based conversations later.
Scrolling through all these awesome questions. I'm like, oh gosh. One question here was also about resources. Are any of the resources that you provided links to lesson plans that support, like that someone could use to support newer teachers, right? So folks who are brand new in the classroom and need sort of more guidance around how to put a lesson together overall. Do you know of resources that center LGBTQ folks or the LGBTQ experience and are sort of like in ready-made lesson plan format?
Yes, so Ready, Set, Respect, also Welcoming Schools program. Both of them have lessons. So they have all of the parts of a lesson plan, and they are put, Ready, Set, Respect is also put in a unit. And I believe actually HRCs also has units. So those, they can be taught as a unit. Even if you are newer to these conversations, those can be, they have everything you need to teach them as a new teacher. I'll also offer that there are a number of picture books that are available, LGBTQ affirming and inclusive picture books. If you find, I can share a list of them. Welcoming Schools has lists of them as well. A lot of times you can find those books being read on YouTube. So read alouds is a great way if you're kind of newer and beginning these conversations. If you don't have access to a picture book budget or your school doesn't have LGBTQ inclusive picture books, you can also find those often read on YouTube and find a video to share with your students. And usually facilitating a discussion after a book that's been read is kind of a way to begin these conversations and this inclusion if you're newer. And really for everyone, but especially if you're newer.
Yeah, I've been so thankful as a, parent of a toddler to have so many options for books that reflect families like ours, different from ours, but kind of like ours, and all of the things in between. I see a really interesting question, and I think this question is interesting because it actually reflects some of emails that we've received about tonight's event. And it says, a sad feeling is often, quote, they are so young, we don't want to sexualize children. And it asks, can you offer a response to this posture from families, school leadership, or staff that differentiates LGBTQ identity and families from sex education? How would you support someone in trying to have that conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is such a good question. It is often still what folks might think about. And I think when people say like they're too young or it's not developmental, what they think we're talking about is like adult sexuality or sexual behavior. And so being able to, with families, administrators, and to have that's kind of what I meant when I was talking about having a shared conversation and understanding of what it is and what it isn't. So working with the community, hopefully again with leadership involvement, but working with folks at the school to say, our LGBTQ inclusion means we are talking about LGBTQ people because they exist in our world, they likely exist in our community. We want to make sure that they are represented when we talk about diverse families. We understand that not everyone in our world falls under these two buckets of being a boy, identifying as a boy and expressing myself in a masculine way, or being a girl and identifying as a girl and expressing myself in a feminine way. We know there's lots of different ways for people to be, and we want to encourage our young people to learn about themselves and to be able to decide for themselves who they are, what they like, what they want to play with. These kinds of conversations really look at if you have a mission statement or you have a diversity and equity statement and seeing where LGBTQ people can fit within that. That really has to have shared that can really help for folks to understand really, again, what it is and what it isn't and what's being taught. And I guess I will just say, as a sexual health educator as well, even in terms of sexual health education in elementary schools, those conversations, even when they have an inclusive lens, they're really talking about, again, like bodily autonomy, setting boundaries, like freedom around who and how people love. And they're really meant to be representative of what we know about people and relationships in the world.
Thank you so much. I think that's such a good set of points. When we think about what it means to be safe at school, when we think about bullying in school and what we've all seen as professionals, but also even as individuals in school, growing up, so much of this shows up. And so this idea that sort of not teaching this is the right way to go feels like it ignores lots of evidence we've had for decades, right, around what it means when students don't feel safe and when we aren't teaching respect really openly and directly in the classroom. Thanks so much for all of you folks for putting so many useful links and resources in the chat. It's amazing. I was actually thinking that what we might do for a few minutes is break out into small groups. So if you're someone that's interested in having a chat with the other folks who have shown up on this call, who want to talk a little bit more about your experience, the things that you're being challenged with, I think we'll make some breakout space for about 10 minutes. And then if there are questions that come from those chats and those check-ins, we'll bring you back in to have a final Q&A before we wrap up this evening. But you'll go out in groups of about 4. Please share where you're coming from, where you work, and why you were here tonight. And then, if there are any questions you can answer for each other, resources you can provide each other, this is an amazing time to do that. It's one of the strengths we saw in the group last time we had Bex on, was just the number of really rich resources provided. So we want to give you all a chance to connect. And then we'll come and close out with Bex with a few more questions at the end. So Tori's going to send us out. And yes, the chat, please, please, please feel free to take a copy and we'll download it for you as well. Hey, folks, Spaces, come on back. Nice to see you. Bex does have a few more questions she's happy to answer. And if y'all want to add any other questions in the chat, we will take as many as we can before we wrap up this evening. But Bex, I know you had a few topics you wanted to jump in on before we go.
Yes, one that came up was around like what do pre-K to second grade students need to know, and it's true, we're talking here in elementary focus, but there is of course like a wide developmental range and just range between pre-K and then all the way until 5th grade, which also sometimes 6th grade, which is also why it is wild to me the idea that LGBTQ inclusion at all at this age like range or within this bucket has our apprehension towards it, since it's such a foundational, fundamental, large portion of schooling. But I wanted to address just at those early ages, really just to acknowledge how gendered our society is around particularly enhancing stereotypes during infancy, pre-K, and early elementary. That is a time in our society in which the stereotyping around boys things, girls things, is really heightened for young people and part of their experiences. And so it is how I approach LGBTQ inclusion, to provide some more space and allow young people to have conversations around and start to see books and pictures and draw their own imagined identities and futures around what they like, what they want to be, what they want to play with, what colors they're interested in, and to build in some space around those conversations. And it is worth noting that there is an increasing number of trans and gender, creative and fluid young people at these ages. And so I did see a question around the idea or the pushback that starting these conversations around gender could be influencing young people or leading them towards trans identity, or confusing them. And so I just want to note that that is really similar pushback that was taught about sexual orientation when that was first being introduced into schools. The pushback in the conversation was, no, we're going to create, we're going to create gay kids and queer kids, and we are, confusing them around their sexual orientation. That kind of pushback really presumes and lives underneath the presumption of heteronormativity, cisgender normativity, and it's really important to understand that that wasn't true. We've proven that not to be true over time, that we have tons of research on how creating supportive environments where young people who are not heterosexual can see themselves in curriculum, can feel affirmed in their schools, are really, but that is not an increase. It's really environment allowing folks to be who they are. And it's a really similar thing with gender, that what we're providing is a space for young people really to not be confused around the incredible messaging that they are receiving and the privileging that we do have in our society along the gender binary. I could talk about gender binarism all day, but I will not. But just really thinking, about that we do have a society that privileges folks within the gender norms, quote unquote. So really, just what we're doing is providing space, especially at a critical age where young people are deciding for themselves who they are, again, what they want to play with, and not having to unlearn something that they're being told they are or that they should be.
Awesome. I see one last question here, which is resources specifically for administrators, thinking about maybe, you know, research, less of like the lesson plans, but more sort of the overarching sort of underpinning of a reasoning for sort of starting a shift in their school cultures? Are there specific resources either on the list that we had from earlier this evening or other resources that you would suggest for administrators? Thanks.
Yes, and it's such an important question. Again, I do think that this work is best when it's done with even the guided support of administrators, when even if you are, say, someone in a school who is not the school leader, but who is leading this work, if you can work with the administrators in the school so that communications around LGBTQ inclusion or curriculum that's being taught or days that are being implemented come from the administrator themselves, that is always the best practice for the school. And that if they are leading the communication to families rather than coming from just one classroom teacher, that's always really helpful for shifting school culture. There's a great resource that I can share with Joy, or perhaps find in the chat, called Respect for All. It's a GLSEN resource that looks at district-wide policy changes and is excellent for administrators, and it shows examples all across the country of schools that are implementing supportive policies and considerations, and talks about things I've mentioned here, like professional development, communication, looking at school culture, monitoring school culture, and collecting that data and information in order to move forward supports and procedures that are LGBTQ affirming in schools.
There's another question that I missed earlier, sorry, that said, one area I've found challenging is how to bring in LGBTQ folks into discussion, like on contributions to history or science. And that when we bring in figures who are women or African American, we discuss those contributions without sort of naming, and this is a woman, or this person was Black, right? Like, do you have any suggestions for ways to incorporate an LGBTQ sort of lens in those situations when the person, you know, is a scientist or, you know, whatever, a writer? How do you bring up that they're LGBTQ as well?
It's such a good question. There is a couple of ways to do that. One thing that you could do, depending on the school and depending on the culture that you've set in the school, is name that, we're going to be naming, if we know the different aspects of people's identities as we learn about them this year, this unit, in this class. And that's, you know, what do we think about when we think about identity? What are aspects of them? And then it's another way to talk about that sexual orientation or partnership as part of identity, and to list them, and really also to help young people see that how many folks they're learning about are heterosexual. If you have to list that every single time, that's also a teaching tool for young people to see the overrepresentation of heterosexual authors, you know, scientists, what have it. You know, sometimes we don't know people's sexual orientation, and that can also be a really critical part of the erasure of LGBTQ people throughout time. And so I think those are conversations you can have with young people. And another thing you could do is also mention to young people that, and name this, is that there is not as many LGBTQ people represented throughout history. And so because of that, we're going to start every Monday with an LGBTQ contributor to poetry, Black History Month, you know, things like that, and have like, this is our LGBTQ spotlight of the month, and kind of name it in that way so that folks know. I know folks who do, there are a lot of like scientists will start 5 minutes at the beginning of their science class, they'll highlight a queer or trans person who's contributed, and kind of build an inclusion in that way.
Awesome. Bex, thank you so much. Again and again and again, thank you so much for teaching us. I appreciate you. I appreciate this space. Thank you all for showing up. To answer the question that came a little earlier, I hope you can see my slides. Okay. Earlier I showed my calendar. It was a little awkward, a little embarrassing. So we do have some upcoming coffee and conversations and just events in general. We have a Dismantling Racism in Mathematics series that's kicking off in March. It'll be a multi-month series. There'll be coffee and conversations. There will be small group seminars that offer just like a deep dive into an equity toolkit for math classrooms. If that is something that is your jam, you may want to mark your calendars. Tori has thrown our Eventbrite link into the chat. You can subscribe to our list and then get a ping every time we post a new event on Eventbrite if that is of interest to you. Also, we love feedback. We love feedback. We love feedback here at SAP. So if you have a moment to give feedback on tonight or this Coffee and Conversation series in general, please use the link to do that. And if you'd like to be on our core advocates list to get first access to new events, you can sign up there. Other than that, again, we want to thank Bex for being here tonight. I've just felt so freed by the interest in these topics. Like I mentioned earlier, we got some feedback via email earlier this week about this topic, and it's just so nice to see so many folks joining the conversation and wanting to make spaces safer for all of our students, families, and staff. So nice to see you all. We hope to see you at future events, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all for all you contributed and your resources and the incredible work it's clear that you're doing. Thank you so much, and so thrilled to be a part of this conversation.
Hi, I was wondering, I have a question.
Oh, sure. Hi, Hannah. Yes.
Sometimes I can't always type fast before you guys get off. This was a really exciting experience. I loved the chat rooms. I loved everything. I was wondering, do you guys have, I'm looking forward to, first of all, the upcoming event. Are you going to have another session similar to this? There's just so much stuff I'm excited about and want to take to my administrator. And I don't know. I'm eager and excited.
Yeah. For this topic specifically?
Yeah. Do you have other sessions similar to it?
Not on the calendar yet, but Hannah, you're giving us a really good reason to do this again. So
yeah, I think just with talking to some other colleagues, we were talking about let's keep in touch and let's keep I don't know if there's a way we can just communicate and share. I know on Facebook, I'm a first grade teacher and we always have a post on Facebook where we keep in touch and share each other's ideas. I think this would be awesome if we could do the same.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, we would love to find a way. Hannah, if you or anyone else want to go into that feedback form and put, yes, I would be interested in planning something or working with SAP on something, we would love to work with you. So
where's the feedback form? I'm sorry.
It's there's a bit.ly. Tori just threw it back in the chat again. And I'm always looking for folks to work with to shape the future of these events. So would love to talk more offline about how we could do that more effectively for the future and to keep bringing folks back.
Okay, perfect. So I'll just put my information in the bit.ly, go to there, and then hopefully I'll hear from you guys again.
Absolutely. You will hear from me for sure.
Perfect. All right. Thank you guys.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.